Hello, I'm Shaun Vickers, and today I will be teaching you about the different parts and functions of the brain. Here is the sagittal view of the brain. It is like a cross-section viewing the brain from the side. This allows us to see many different important parts of the brain. We're going to start from the top of the brain and work our way down to the spinal cord. This first part is the cerebral cortex. This next part is called the cingulate gyrus. This next part is called the corpus callosum. It's in the middle and it connects the two hemispheres of the brain. The thalamus is right in the middle. The hypothalamus, pituitary gland is under that. Here we have the superior and inferior colliculi, major parts of the midbrain. That's the midbrain. Cerebellum, the pons, another hindbrain structure, medulla, and finally the spinal cord. Now we can discuss what function each of these parts serve. The cerebral cortex elaborates sensory information and organizes sequences of behaviors. The cingulate gyrus is a structure of the limbic system that helps regulate emotions and pain. The corpus callosum is a bundle of axons that connect the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. The thalamus processes sensory information and sends output to the cerebral cortex. It's kind of the central hub for all the sensory information that comes in from your eyes, nose, ears. Hypothalamus sends messages by nerves and hormones about motivation and emotion. The pituitary gland synthesizes hormones according to information given from the hypothalamus. The superior and inferior colliculi, they are for sensory processing. The inferior colliculus is for hearing, and the superior processes vision. The midbrain connects the hindbrain and the forebrain, and it's mostly used for motory and sensory processing. The cerebellum is important for behaviors that require accurate timing, attention, and balance. Pons is a Latin word for bridge, a place where axons from each half of the brain can cross over to the spinal cord. There's two hemispheres of the brain. The pons is where those axons kind of cross over and connect to the spinal cord that then sends those messages to those opposite parts of the body. The medulla allows connection between the head and the organs via 12 cranial nerves, and the spinal cord communicates with all the sense organs and muscles except those of the head. From an outside view, we can see that the brain contains many folds and grooves. These are called sulci and fissures, and there are four major ones. Here's the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. It's one of the deepest grooves in our brain. There's the lateral fissure that kind of separates the frontal and temporal lobes, as well as part of the parietal and temporal lobe. Calcarine fissure, which is called a spur-shaped fissure, and it's right there in the middle of the occipital lobe. And finally, there's the longitudinal fissure. That's the deep fissure that divides the brain into two hemispheres. Now, you probably already remember these from the previous slide, but here are the locations of the four lobes of the cerebral cortex: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. You can see the frontal lobe here is near the front of your head and the top. The temporal lobe is just under that. It's called temporal because it's right behind your temples. The parietal lobe is nicknamed the wall because it kind of forms a wall between the frontal and the front and back of your brain, basically, the frontal and occipital. And the occipital lobe is right there in the back of your head. Each lobe has primary functions related to different sensory inputs. The frontal lobe controls fine motor movement in its posterior portion, called the precentral gyrus, and the anterior prefrontal cortex processes the need for movement, emotional reaction, decision making, and memory. A lot of the cerebral processes are taken care of in this prefrontal cortex. The parietal lobe controls sensations from touch muscles and joints in its post-central gyrus. It also monitors eye, head, and body positions and passes the info to movement control. Numerical info processing also takes place here. Our spatial awareness is taken care of in the parietal lobe, and when we're younger, we count on our fingers. The temporal lobe processes auditory information. It is essential for understanding language and complex aspects of vision, like recognizing faces and perception of movement. Hallucinations, interesting enough, are often produced there as well. If there's a tumor on your temporal lobe, it can cause hallucinations. Whereas if you had a tumor on your occipital lobe, which we'll cover next, you might just see like flashes of light, but nothing detailed. The occipital lobe is the main processor of visual information. It takes information gathered by the sensory organs, the eyes, and creates the experience that we see. Damage in this lobe can cause cortical blindness. The four lobes each contain a primary cortex related to the sensory information each one receives. There are also many other smaller cortices, but these are the main ones. We have the primary motor cortex, that is also called the precentral gyrus, right next to the central sulcus. There is the primary somatosensory cortex, or the postcentral gyrus. It's in the parietal lobe. We have the auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex, as superior and central, right in the middle of the temporal lobe. And the visual cortex, that kind of runs along the calcarine fissure. The primary motor cortex is also called the motor strip, and it's arranged upside down and contralateral. The primary somatosensory cortex is arranged contralateral and upside down, and it has different bands that run parallel to the central sulcus. The functions of the primary cortices are pretty similar to the overall functions of the lobes they're found in, but more specific. A primary motor cortex, also known as the precentral gyrus, this area controls movement, especially fine movements like finger muscles. Each side controls muscles on the opposite side. I find this interesting because personally I play cello, and so that primary motor cortex is what controls all the fine finger movements I have to do. Primary somatosensory cortex, also known as the postcentral gyrus, this area receives sensations from touch receptors, muscle stretch receptors, and joint receptors. It also contains different bands of cells for various pressures. So there's like 4 major bands. 2 of them are for more light pressures. There's one that's in between light and deep pressure, and then one that's mainly for like stronger pressures. So when you touch something lightly, that's a different band than if you grab something strong. The primary auditory cortex processes information associated with hearing, such as pitch, volume, and tone, essential for understanding language and music. Primary visual cortex, also known as the striate, it's named this because the cross-section of it appears striped. And this area, along with the calcarine fissure, processes visual information. Damage here causes cortical blindness or visual agnosia. And those are the main parts and functions of the brain. Thank you for watching.